Hey guys, so I'm gonna talk about Alto Flute again today, because I think we need to do a follow-up to Alto Flute 101. Um, I want to talk about more of the practical things and the things that you guys need to be aware of when you're playing and kind of practicing. And I think the first thing is really the limitations, which I touched on a little bit in the last video, but we didn't really talk about dynamic or projection limitations, and that's really the big issue that you'll encounter on alto flute. Projection is very, very difficult because of the tone color of the instrument. It doesn't project very far, and you have to be very, very conscious of how you're using your air to get it to project, and that takes a lot of time and practice. I did a lot of long tones, like a lot. My suggestion is actually to do things in the middle range because that's the easiest range to project because of the tone quality. It's a little bit sharper and a little bit brighter than the low range. So if you can really get that to project, then you can start bringing that idea down into the low range, which is very warm and rich and gorgeous, but it's just kind of fluffy and it doesn't want to project. The thing is, you kind of are going to have to temper that color a little bit, which is hard, I know, to get it to project farther in the lower range. So getting it very, very solid in the upper range that's easier is then going to be easier to bring it down. It's really personal, and it's all about your mouth shape and your air. You always are going to need faster air than you think on the big flutes. There's kind of this idea that the bigger the flute, the slower the air, which is true to an extent, but in reality, it's such a minimal difference that it's much more about the way your air interacts with the flute. It's going to be a wider embouchure, and it's going to be more air at once. So how does that air interact? Is it going fast and going directly into the flute? Because that's not going to work. Is it slow and just kind of skimming over the top? Because that's not going to work. You really have to find the balance of speed and direction. And that's true with all flutes, but it's more apparent on alto just because you don't have the flexibility or room for error that you do on flute, which I know sounds crazy to some of you guys that are working on embouchure and are working on tone and are working on all those things, but honestly, if you can do it on alto flute, you'll be able to do it on anything. Maybe not bass flute, but we're gonna leave that one in a corner. The other big issue the other big limitation is dynamic range. The range is smaller, which means that all of your dynamics still have to be proportional to each other. You still need a triple forte or something equivalent, and you still need a triple piano that hopefully projects. Honestly, for me, I take most of the soft dynamics up a dynamic or two just so that they do project, and then try to kind of smush my range a little bit together so that there still is a loud end. But pianissimo alto flute is kind of one of those moments where you might as well not play. You're not going to be heard. And that's not because you're not playing it properly, it's because of the instrument. That gets into my next point. When you're playing in an ensemble, even just a flute ensemble, where you have a like sound production and like tone colors, you have to be very, very conscious of the fact that you need dynamic help. If there's something that's super important in your part, you're going to need the other people in the ensemble to bring it down slightly, and you need to come up a little bit more than you want to be able to have it speak. And that's not your fault, that's the instrument, and that's the way it produces sound. And it's also the fact that almost every other instrument you're going to be playing with projects further and projects louder. A great example of this is the wind ensemble piece by Michael Colgrass, Winds of Nagal. There's a really, really big alto flute solo in the middle, and most of the ensemble is playing. And no matter how loud you are, unless you have a mic, you cannot be heard unless the ensemble brings it down. Like, the composer himself has said that. And that's nothing against you as a player. Like, if you're playing that part, it's not your fault that you can't be heard if you're doing everything right. So just keeping in mind that when you're playing in an ensemble, you have to fight for yourself almost. You have to make sure that everyone else is coming down when you're important, because you can't come up enough. I think that's the big thing, is like, you just can't get to their sound projection. So they need to help you. And I know that makes alto flute sound like a pain, and it is, but once you get it, it's great. My biggest suggestion for getting all of these things figured out is long tones. Do tiered dynamics on a single note, like go from a pianissimo to a piano to a mezzo piano to a mezzo forte to a forte to a fortissimo, and then back down, and make sure that each half note or whole note that you're playing is, one, noticeably different, and two, still has a good sound. And once you get that going, start thinking about how it's projecting. I know it's hard in small practice rooms. It's a lot easier in this space because we have more room, but when I was playing in practice rooms, it was a lot harder. You kind of have to think about playing in a bigger hall and imagine that acoustic, and that's hard when you're in a tiny crappy practice room, I know. But if you can think about the way you would play in that space and the way you would play flute in that space, and then apply it to your alto flute embouchure, it starts getting a little easier. And honestly, try to get practice sessions in bigger spaces on occasion. I know that we could we could book classrooms out. If the classrooms were open, we could use them, and also we occasionally had access to our halls. So take advantage of that if you can. I think the last thing I want to leave this video on is like the application of alto flute in ensembles, because it's kind of a quote-unquote gimmick instrument, which isn't true, but it's not something that you get all the time. In orchestral playing, it really is used for the color and for this dramatic change. In Holst, for example, it's very much used as the color. It's used to fill out the bottom of the flute chorales, and it's really kind of used almost as like a flute choir instrument, which it is. In things like Stravinsky, he uses it for a stark contrast, and he uses it for an aggressive melodic content, which is actually really cool because usually alto flute doesn't get to do that. There's a ton of flute choir music, but there's also a lot of solo stuff popping up, especially contemporary. A lot of the extended techniques that you guys know I love actually speak better on alto flute because you get more resonance and it's a bigger tube. And a lot of the percussive sounds just are relying on the tube and not on the flute itself. And so there's a lot of new things popping up for alto flute, and it's an instrument that is seen as very limited, and I know I just talked for like 5-10 minutes about its limitations, but once you acknowledge them and kind of work them into the instrument rather than seeing them as limitations, it's really, really fun to push it and to see where it can go. I hope this helps in some way. Honestly, for me, alto flute is so personal that it's really hard for me to be like, you should practice it this way, because one, every instrument's different, two, they all have their own tuning intricacies, and three, everyone has a different setup for them, so it really just depends on what you're doing. That being said, I think everyone should play alto at some point. I think it really helps your flute knowledge, and it does help your flute playing. So if you guys ever get a chance to play alto, don't turn it down. Yeah, I will see you guys later today for the normal 365 video, and I will continue seeing you guys every day for the next, like, 300 days.